The phone call came into Nashville at 3:47 in the morning, Pacific Time, October 4th, 1965. A voice on the other end said four words that would send shockwaves through the country music establishment. Johnny's been arrested. Border within 30 minutes, three of the most powerful men in the industry were awake, dressed, and making calls to lawyers, judges, and anyone who could help contain what was about to become the biggest scandal in country music history. But what they didn't know yet was that this time, the evidence was too concrete to make disappear. This time, there were 688 reasons why Johnny Cash might be going to federal prison. What was Johnny doing in Mexico for 3 days? The official story that would later appear in newspapers was vague. Vacation or visiting friends. But FBI documents declassified decades later tell a different story, one involving a pharmacy in Juárez, a doctor who'd lost his American medical license, and a cash transaction that exceeded $10,000. Federal agents had been tracking Johnny's border crossings for weeks, building a case that went far beyond simple drug possession. They suspected he was part of a pipeline that supplied Nashville's music industry with prescription medications that kept performers on the road, in the studio, and slowly dying in plain sight. Elvis Presley heard about the arrest within hours. He and Johnny had a complicated relationship, mutual respect mixed with rivalry, and Elvis himself was no stranger to prescription medication. But even Elvis was shocked when he learned the numbers: 688 Dexedrine, 475 Equanil. He would later tell a Memphis journalist off the record, "That's not using, that's something else entirely. That's a man trying to chemically become someone different than who he is." Elvis understood the pressure of fame, the impossible schedule, the expectation to be superhuman. But he also understood that Johnny had crossed a line that might be impossible to come back from. In that El Paso customs station, as agents counted pills and filled out arrest paperwork, Johnny Cash sat in a holding cell, coming down from a 3-day amphetamine binge, facing federal charges that could send him to prison for 5 to 10 years. And back in Nashville, June Carter sat by her phone, waiting for news about the man she loved and feared for in equal measure, knowing that everything was about to change, and that the next 24 hours would determine whether the man in black would survive his darkest moment, or be consumed by it entirely. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now and join us on this journey through the darkness and redemption of Johnny Cash. To understand what happened at that border crossing in October 1965, you have to go back 3 years earlier to a tour bus somewhere between Little Rock and Memphis, where Johnny Cash took his first Dexedrine tablet. A drummer offered him a pill, said it would help him stay awake for the overnight drive and the early morning recording session, and Johnny swallowed it without much thought. Within an hour, he felt more alert, more focused, more capable than he'd felt in months. The exhaustion that had been building from playing 6 nights a week vanished. His mind sharpened. Ideas for songs came faster, and when he walked into the studio that morning, he recorded 3 tracks in 4 hours, each one a first take, each one perfect. That's how it starts. Not with a descent into hell, but with a solution to a problem. Johnny Cash in 1962 was at a crossroads in his career. He'd had major hits with I Walk the Line and Folsom Prison Blues, but the music industry was changing rapidly. The Beatles were coming, country music was struggling to maintain its audience, and record executives were putting enormous pressure on their artists to produce more, tour more, be more. Johnny was recording 2 albums a year, playing over 200 shows annually, making television appearances, doing radio interviews, all while trying to maintain some semblance of family life with his wife Vivian and their 4 daughters back in California. The amphetamines seemed like a miracle. For months, it worked perfectly. Ring of Fire went to #1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. His career was reaching heights he'd only dreamed about back in those cotton fields in Arkansas. But amphetamines don't give you energy, they just borrow it from your future self, and eventually that debt comes due with devastating interest. By 1963, Johnny needed the pills just to feel normal. He went from taking 1 pill before a show to taking 3, then 5, then 10. And when the amphetamines made it impossible to sleep, he discovered barbiturates, sedatives that could bring him down from the chemical high. His weight dropped from 190 pounds to 150. His hands developed a tremor. His temper became unpredictable, explosive, but he kept performing, kept recording, kept smiling for the cameras, because admitting he had a problem would mean admitting weakness. And in the country music industry of the 1960s, weakness meant the end of a career. But the real problem wasn't just the pills Johnny was taking, it was where he was getting them. Because by 1964, no doctor in Tennessee would write him prescriptions anymore. They'd seen too many refill requests, heard too many stories about lost bottles and stolen medication. So Johnny had to get creative, and that creativity would eventually lead him to a dusty pharmacy in Juárez, Mexico, where prescriptions were optional and questions were never asked. What most people don't understand about the music industry in the 1960s is how sophisticated the protection systems were for major artists. Nashville had perfected the art of making problems disappear. When a star got arrested for drunk driving, a judge who loved country music would make the charges vanish. When a performer showed up too intoxicated to go on stage, the venue owner would refund tickets and tell the audience there'd been a family emergency. The machinery was so well-oiled that artists could spiral into addiction for years without facing any real consequences. Johnny Cash benefited from this system more than almost anyone. Between 1962 and 1965, there were at least a dozen incidents that should have ended his career. There was the show in Jacksonville where he forgot the lyrics to his own songs and stood on stage for 15 minutes just talking incoherently until his band let him off. There was the night in Dallas when police found him wandering in traffic at 3 in the morning, confused about where he was. Every single one of these incidents was handled quietly, efficiently by people whose job was to protect the investment that Johnny Cash represented. But there were limits to what could be protected. The FBI had opened a file on him in early 1965. His increasingly erratic behavior and frequent trips to Mexico had raised red flags. Special Agent Robert Morrison was assigned to Johnny's case, and for 6 months Morrison had been building a file that included surveillance photographs, border crossing records, and confidential informant reports from people in the Nashville music scene. Morrison's file contained details that would have shocked Johnny's fans. There were reports of Johnny paying cash for pills at pharmacies across Mexico, sometimes spending thousands of dollars in a single transaction. The FBI wasn't planning to arrest Johnny Cash, at least not initially. They were watching him, gathering evidence, waiting to see if he would lead them to something bigger. The 3 days Johnny spent in Mexico before his arrest remain mysterious even now, decades later. Some of what happened is documented in FBI files, some is recorded in Johnny's own later admissions, and some has never been fully explained. But what's certain is that Johnny went to Juárez with a specific purpose, and that purpose was about to collide with consequences he'd never imagined possible. October 1st, 1965. Johnny Cash crossed the border at El Paso driving a 1964 Cadillac Eldorado, alone with nothing declared at customs except a guitar and personal luggage. He drove into Juárez and checked into a small hotel 3 blocks from the red light district, a place where Americans came when they wanted to disappear for a while. What Johnny did for the next 72 hours is a mixture of documented fact and educated speculation. The FBI file shows he visited at least 3 pharmacies, making cash purchases that totaled over $8,000. But there's also a gap in the timeline, a period of about 18 hours where Johnny's whereabouts are unknown. Years later, Johnny would hint at this missing time with a cryptic comment, "There are some things from those days that I'll take to my grave, not because I'm ashamed, but because other people were involved who don't deserve to have their lives dragged into my mistakes." The FBI suspected Johnny wasn't just buying for himself. They believed he was part of a larger network, buying for other performers in Nashville who were caught in the same pharmaceutical trap. If that's true, then his arrest wasn't just about his personal demons, it was about an entire industry's secret addiction, and Johnny was about to become the public face of a problem Nashville had been hiding for years. On the morning of October 4th, Johnny packed his car and headed back toward the El Paso border crossing. But this time was different. This time, customs officials had received a tip from the FBI. Special Agent Morrison contacted customs officials at the El Paso bridge and gave them a directive: if Johnny Cash attempts to cross back into the United States, search everything. Customs Agent Bill Williams was the man who received that directive. When Johnny's Cadillac pulled up to Checkpoint 7 at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Williams recognized him immediately. But Williams knew his job, and his job that day was to search this particular vehicle more thoroughly than any celebrity had probably ever been searched at this border. What happened next would be described in courtroom testimony, FBI reports, and eventually Johnny's own autobiography. But each version tells a slightly different story, and in those differences lie questions that have never been fully answered about what Johnny was really doing in Mexico and who else might have been involved. Williams asked Johnny to step out of the vehicle. Johnny complied, but his hands were shaking. His pupils were constricted to pinpoints despite the bright afternoon sun. His speech was rapid, pressured, jumping from topic to topic. "Is there a problem, officer? I'm expected in Dallas tomorrow. I have a show. Do you know who I am?" The words came out in a rush, defensive and anxious, the words of someone who knew exactly what was about to be found. Williams opened the trunk first. Luggage. A spare tire. Nothing unusual. Then he opened the guitar case. The guitar itself was a Gibson acoustic, well worn, clearly used frequently. But when Williams lifted it out of the case, he noticed the weight was wrong. Williams looked inside the sound hole and saw that the interior had been modified. There were packages taped to the inside of the body, wrapped in cloth and secured with electrical tape. Williams carefully removed the guitar strings and loosened the bridge to access the packages. Inside, prescription pill bottles, dozens of them, from various pharmacies in Juárez. He then searched the luggage and found more pills hidden in socks, wrapped inside clothing, tucked into toiletry bags. The search took over an hour. By the time Williams was finished, he'd laid out on the inspection table one of the largest pharmaceutical seizures in El Paso border history: 688 Dexedrine capsules, 475 Equanil tablets, and various other prescription medications totaling over 1,200 pills. Johnny sat on a metal chair during the entire search, watching the pills pile up, his career disintegrating in real time with each new bottle Williams discovered. When Williams began the formal arrest procedure, Johnny said something that would appear in the official report: "I need those. I can't function without them. You don't understand. I have shows scheduled. People are depending on me." It wasn't a denial. It was a simple statement of fact from a man who'd long since passed the point where he could imagine life without chemical assistance. The arrest paperwork was extensive: federal drug charges, smuggling charges, violation of customs regulations. Each charge carried potential prison time. As backup officers arrived to transport him to the El Paso County Jail, the FBI was notified immediately. Special Agent Morrison began expanding the investigation, because if Johnny had this many pills, if he was transporting them across international borders, if he'd modified a guitar to hide them, then this wasn't simple personal use. This was potentially distribution, conspiracy, organized smuggling. But even as Johnny was being fingerprinted and photographed at the El Paso jail, even as the pills were being cataloged and logged as evidence, the Nashville machine was already spinning into action. 3 phone calls made in the hours after Johnny's arrest would determine everything that came next. The first call went from El Paso to Nashville at 4:15 p.m. Central Time. It reached Wesley Rose, the most powerful music publisher in country music, a man who had millions of dollars riding on Johnny's continued success. Within minutes, he'd contacted the most prestigious law firm in Tennessee. Within an hour, 2 lawyers were on a plane to El Paso with specific instructions: contain the media coverage, negotiate the charges down, and get Johnny out of jail before the story became national news. The second call was more personal. It went to June Carter, who'd been waiting by her phone with the kind of dread that comes from loving someone who's slowly destroying themselves. June had watched Johnny's descent for 2 years, had tried interventions and ultimatums and everything in between. When she heard he'd been arrested at the border with over 1,000 pills, her first response wasn't shock. It was a terrible, sad kind of validation. This was what she'd been fearing. June made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of both their lives. She called her mother Mabel Carter, a legend in country music herself. Together they began making calls to radio stations, asking program directors to hold off on reporting the story. They called music journalists, leveraging decades of goodwill to request balanced coverage. It was crisis management on a personal level, two women trying to save a man who might not be capable of saving himself. In his cell at the El Paso jail, Johnny was experiencing the crash that always followed an amphetamine binge. The tremors had intensified to the point where he couldn't hold a cup of water. His body alternated between fever sweats and chills. Nausea came in waves. The jail doctor noted that Johnny appeared to be experiencing acute withdrawal symptoms and recommended hospitalization. But moving Johnny to a hospital would have meant more publicity, so Johnny remained in that cell, suffering through a medical crisis while lawyers and loved ones fought over his future. What Johnny didn't know during those long hours in the El Paso jail was that the FBI was offering him a deal. They didn't really care about Johnny Cash, the drug user. They cared about Johnny Cash, the potential informant. They wanted names of who in Nashville was part of the pharmaceutical pipeline, and they were willing to make Johnny's problems disappear entirely if he cooperated. October 5, 1965. Johnny had been in custody for approximately 16 hours when his lawyer arrived with news. The charges were being reduced. Federal prosecutors had agreed to drop the more serious smuggling and distribution charges. Johnny would plead guilty to simple possession, a misdemeanor, and pay a fine of approximately $1,000. There would be no prison time, no felony conviction. It was an extraordinarily favorable outcome given the circumstances. But there was a condition. The FBI wanted Johnny to provide information about drug networks in the Nashville music industry. They wanted names, details, patterns. Johnny refused, not defiantly but with quiet certainty. Years later, Johnny would explain, "I was a lot of things in those days. I was an addict, a bad husband, an unreliable performer, but I wasn't going to be a snitch. Some lines you don't cross, even when crossing them might save you." On October 6, Johnny Cash was released from the El Paso County Jail. He pleaded guilty to possession of controlled substances in a brief court hearing. The judge delivered a stern lecture while imposing a minimal sentence, $1,000 fine, 1-year probation, mandatory addiction counseling. It was a slap on the wrist that would have been unthinkable for any ordinary citizen, but for a celebrity with expensive lawyers and powerful friends, it was simply how the system worked. But the legal resolution was only the beginning of Johnny's problems. Because while Nashville had successfully kept the worst details out of the newspapers, while his lawyers had negotiated a deal that preserved his freedom, there was still the fundamental issue. Johnny was an addict who needed approximately 100 pills a day just to function, and he just lost his primary source of supply. The newspaper coverage of Johnny's arrest was surprisingly muted, testament to the effectiveness of Nashville's crisis management. Most national newspapers didn't cover the story at all. In an era before 24-hour news cycles and social media, it was possible for even major celebrities to have legal problems that didn't become defining scandals. But within the Nashville music community, the arrest was an earthquake. The question on everyone's mind was whether Johnny would survive this professionally. June Carter became the center of Johnny's rehabilitation effort. In the weeks following the arrest, June essentially moved into Johnny's house, not as a romantic partner but as a guardian. She monitored his medication, drove him to counseling appointments, and sat with him through the worst of the withdrawal symptoms as he tried to reduce his pill intake from 100 a day to something approaching normal. The withdrawal was brutal. Amphetamines and barbiturates create physical and psychological dependencies that intertwine in complex ways. Johnny had to be gradually weaned off the medications under medical supervision, a process that took months and required residential treatment at a private facility in Tennessee. During that time, he missed shows, canceled recording sessions, and essentially disappeared from public view. The official story was exhaustion. The reality was that he was fighting for his life. But there was one more revelation to come, one more layer to the El Paso arrest that wouldn't be revealed until decades later, when FBI files were declassified, and this revelation would change the entire understanding of what had really happened on that October day in 1965. In 2006, more than 40 years after Johnny's arrest, a music historian named Michael Streisguth filed a Freedom of Information Act request for FBI files related to the singer. What he received contained over 300 pages. Buried in the middle was a memo that revealed something shocking. The tip that led to Johnny's arrest hadn't come from routine surveillance. It had come from someone in the Nashville music industry itself. The memo, dated September 28, 1965, 6 days before Johnny's arrest, documented a phone call received by the FBI's Nashville field office. The caller, whose name was redacted, informed agents that Johnny Cash was planning to travel to Mexico to purchase illegal prescription drugs and would be crossing back into the United States at El Paso on or around October 4th. The caller provided specific details about the medications Johnny was seeking. Who made that call? The documents don't reveal the identity. Some believe it was someone from Johnny's management, hoping an arrest would force him into treatment. Others suggest it might have been a rival, and some theorize it was someone genuinely concerned about his well-being, believing legal intervention was the only way to prevent his death. Johnny himself, before he died in 2003, was asked about the FBI informant. His response was enigmatic. "Whoever called the FBI on me probably saved my life. I was on a path that was only going to end one way. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing. You just can't see it at the time." The El Paso arrest forced Johnny to confront his addiction in ways that years of private struggle had failed to achieve. It made his problem public, which removed his ability to hide it, and it galvanized the people who loved him, particularly June Carter, to take more aggressive action in trying to save him. Johnny Cash lived for another 38 years after his arrest at the El Paso border. He would face relapses and ongoing battles with addiction that never fully disappeared. But he would also create some of his greatest work, including the legendary Folsom Prison concert in 1968 that transformed his career. He would marry June Carter in 1968, and their partnership would become one of country music's greatest love stories. And he would eventually achieve a kind of redemption that seemed impossible during those dark days in October 1965. The 688 pills that were confiscated that day remained in evidence lockers for several years before being destroyed. But they left a legacy that extended far beyond their physical existence. They became a symbol of the pharmaceutical crisis that was beginning to grip America in the 1960s. They exposed the music industry's complicity in enabling addiction, forcing conversations about tour schedules, performance pressures, and the human cost of commercial success. Elvis Presley, who'd been so shocked by Johnny's arrest, would die of prescription drug overdose in 1977, never achieving the recovery that Johnny found. Dozens of other musicians from that era would suffer similar fates. Johnny survived because a combination of luck, legal intervention, and June Carter's stubborn refusal to give up on him created the conditions for recovery. In one of his final interviews, he reflected, "Those pills almost killed me, the arrest probably saved me, and the embarrassment of it all, having my worst moments exposed for the world to see, that might have been the most important part, because I couldn't hide anymore. Everyone knew the truth, and that meant I had to face the truth too." Johnny Cash's story doesn't provide easy answers about how to address addiction, but it does offer something valuable, a real example of someone who hit bottom publicly, faced consequences that could have ended everything, and managed to climb back to not just survival but genuine achievement. It's a story of struggle, relapse, ongoing effort, and the absolute necessity of having people in your life who refuse to abandon you. The man in black survived the 688 pills. He survived the arrest, the headlines, the humiliation, and the brutal months of withdrawal and recovery. He survived to create more music, to influence generations of artists, to become an icon who transcended country music to represent something larger about American resilience and the possibility of second chances. June Carter Cash said it best. Years after Johnny's death, I got the call that Johnny had been arrested, and I knew right then that everything would change. Either he would die from this, or he would find a way to live. There wasn't any middle ground anymore, and thank God he chose to live. Not perfectly, not easily, but he chose it. And that choice, made in a jail cell in El Paso after being caught with enough pills to kill him 10 times over, that choice made everything else possible.